Welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, Editor-in-Chief of CraftsmanOnline.com, and it's a first to welcome him onto our podcast, Brother B.R. Hubbard. Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me this evening.
And after a great explanation, we can share he's an excellent high priest of Suwassett Chapter number 195. How did I do with that?
That's perfect.
All right. Port Jefferson, Long Island. And he was an excellent high priest from 2019 to 2021. And when we had this discussion in an email, you said, hey, I'd like to talk about traditional observance in the York Rite. And I thought, what? This is happening in the York Rite? I think most brothers will be familiar with TO as not necessarily a Masonic rite, but really kind of a best practices model that happens in our blue lodges or our symbolic lodges. And I always look at it as kind of a way to it's a response to some of the trends that were made to retain or increase membership numbers over the past 10, 20 years. But how would you define traditional observance, and what comes to mind when you think of those words?
It certainly is not a rite or any sort of a separation from the Freemasonry that we're familiar with in any way, shape, or form. It's a best practices is one way of putting it. I would say it's a bit of an initiative that it's aimed at setting the most conducive and evocative conditions for the individual and collective journey towards true inner transformation. So the word or the term traditional observance is one that it comes under heavy fire from a lot of different angles, and I'm sure we'll be able to speak about that a little bit as the podcast goes on. But in some circles, traditional observance has actually morphed into just observant Masonry. In the Grand Lodge of New York, for example, observant Masonry is governed by a committee. And you could earn, and then we're talking about the craft lodge level, you can earn the suffix OM, which stands for Observant Masonry. The reason that is because some within the Masonic circles feel that traditional observance is not perhaps the best term to describe what that initiative is. Because traditionally, even in the 18th century, ribaldry and hijinks. I mean, that happened back then as much as it does now, the age-old goat in the closet sort of joke. I mean, these Masons were rowdy, they were rambunctious, even 100, 200 years ago. So when we talk about tradition, what tradition are we trying to observe? And I actually prefer it's a little bit more of a charged term, but perhaps a little bit more universally descriptive. And that would be more of fundamentalist Freemasonry or Masonic fundamentalism, which of course carries a lot of baggage in the vernacular, which is perhaps unwanted in an already heavily scrutinized organization such as ours. But if you look at what that term means of Masonic fundamentalism, it's a little bit more pointed and accurate towards what traditional observance is going for. So for the terms of what we're trying to discuss here, I think traditional observance will stick with that now that I've prefaced it. But it's also very interesting that you mentioned it's a sort of a response towards recent trends in membership retention, and perhaps we could extend that to member attraction as well. Some of the ways that they're trying to get people to join the craft. And I'd have to say it's very nice of you to be so kind, if not euphemistic in that regard. It's a very interesting point, though. And if you look at the various programs and these trends, as you call it, who are they really aimed at? And more specifically, who's creating them? Are they one and the same demographic, or is it perhaps just a little off the mark? It's sort of like, fishing with the wrong bait. And so, the craft has certainly changed a lot over the last 20 to 30 years. In a sense, it's always changing. It's a living craft. And at the same time, staying very much so the same. We have our traditions, our rituals, so on. So if attraction and retention is your goal, and you're looking for the kind of demographic that's going to carry the craft forward into the future, and I'm kind of looking here at younger people, and in Masonry, I consider younger people more or less anybody under 50 or so. It's just a reality. I mean, it's
right.
You ask what a young Mason is. If somebody's 49, they're mostly considered a younger Mason.
We're a kid. Yeah, absolutely.
Or a kid. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's not a problem. It's just we're looking at it for what it is. But with this demographic, look at what draws them. And in my experience, which is quite practical and incidentally coming from a member of that demographic, those who are going to become your serious Masons are looking for exactly what the craft promises to deliver. And it's that depth of experience and the possibility for real inner transformation. I'd even go as far to say it's the first tier of the spiritual process, at least as far as the Western esoteric tradition is concerned. And coincidentally, it's exactly what traditional observance Masonry is aimed at. So the idea that, somebody in their 20s, 30s, 40s, you name the age, and perhaps they're a professional, they have some kind of family, bills to pay, that sort of thing. And maybe they spend part of their day in dry, useless, repetitive meetings at the workplace or wherever they are. The idea that this person is going to, suit up on any given night of the week and attend yet another dry, useless, and repetitive meeting it's ludicrous. And mainstream Masonry has become, more to resemble a Rotary Club, with some drabs of antiquated language put in there. But whatever the glimpse of real Masonry that they get in that process, they're still being sold a bill of goods. And I'm talking in the induction process, the initiation process. They might get the essence of what Masonry is, maybe very clearly. Maybe the ritual is phenomenal. But once that transitions into the meetings, the weekly, monthly meetings, they sort of really quickly come to realize that there's no real substance to back it up, and soon they're gone pretty quickly after. That's the same whether you're talking about mainstream Blue Lodge craft Masonry or you're talking about Royal Arch. It's actually a little bit worse in the Royal Arch. People tend to figure it out a little bit quicker. So retention, once you've attracted them, those new members, retaining them, it really requires that you're providing some sort of value. And Masonry has to overcome, it's an absolute enormous amount of inertia in the modern world. People are busy, and the idea of meeting some new friends and going out and having some beer and pretzels, that doesn't really cut it for the more serious types, the ones that we're collectively looking to be the future of the craft in the state and beyond. So, if you're baiting the beer and pretzel crowd, that's all that's going to be perpetuated through the next generation and beyond. So you have to deliver value, and you're more delivering the value than creating it, right? Because the value is there already. It's more that we're revealing the value that already exists. And the way to reveal what's already there is to follow the template that has been given to us as diligently as possible. That template exists in the form of our ritual books, the Constitution to some degree, how to run things, efficiently. And that's really where traditional observance becomes eminently relevant.
So much there in an opening statement.
Yeah, it's not a light topic. This isn't sort of your, let's have a drive to work and get it through a quick little Masonic topic. It's very heavy because it deals with the core, the root and marrow of the craft.
This hits the passion button big time. And it's interesting because when I first hear, and I like how you've said more observant Masonry, so I'm going to feel comfortable using that term for the rest of the podcast and probably beyond.
Sure.
I think of Andrew Hammer's, Observing the Craft. There's several other brothers that have written on this, and you kind of surmised it well, where you said this is basically a lodge that has decided to take the ritual aspects and the traditions a little bit more seriously and to form. When I think of the first observant Masonry that I witnessed, it was officers wore the tux and tails with the white jackets and the white vest. They wore gloves inside of the meetings. That just the first thing for some brothers that are used to country lodges or maybe a little bit more relaxed lodges, just the idea of wearing a dark suit and tie, it can be a challenge for some brothers or a barrier to entry. So to go to a TO lodge and see everybody wearing a tuxedo, you're like, wow, these these guys are serious. There's something going on here. But then it also goes beyond that to where the meetings themselves are not the typical, we're going to have a business meeting to talk about the business of the lodge as far as finances and all the stuff that we can complain about. The focus of these meetings is really to have those deeper intellectual discussions. And I think you're absolutely right when you say what Observant Masonry attracts are the brothers who came in, knocked on the door, were told you're going to take this 3-degree system. You're introduced, especially in New York State, to ritual that contains a lot of Old English and a lot of history that requires unpacking, both on the biblical sense, but then also when you start to get into some of the questions as to when was this written? What was it like when the men that were doing this, the forefathers or previous generations that were all participating in this, what was going on during the time that this was being formed, and how does that relate to me now in present day? You have these bigger thinkers, and I'm speaking from personal experience here where you go through a year of becoming a Master Mason through the 3-degree system. You get raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason, and you're expecting that every single lodge meeting that you're going to come to, these lessons, these teachings, everything that you've heard in the degree ritual is what is going to be a part of the meeting. And after a handful, and I'm sure I'm not the only brother to ever say this, you become extremely dissatisfied because that is usually not the case, I would say, for most Masons. So what I find interesting as we talk about the OM movement, especially in the concordant bodies, is that I've always described the appendant bodies of Freemasonry as kind of the Masonic all-stars. From my experience, these are the brothers in chapter and that also get into, the Scottish Rite. These are the guys who are seeking that further enlightened Masonry, and they're around other brothers from other lodges who are all hyper into and hyper focused into it. Like, sure, you might get some guys that are in there just to get the extra degrees or continue to hear the story and, the different veins that it goes through. But for the most part, you have the brothers that are really focused on continuing those Masonic traditions. So that's what I find so interesting, that the Observant movement would get to the chapter, because what I'm thinking is, how much more serious could these guys get when they've decided to take these extra degrees and these further steps themselves?
Again, I think you're a very generous commentator. My experience of, I got to be careful here, but my experience of the York Rite and concordant bodies does not necessarily mirror that. And the problems, the personalities, what's endemic in one is endemic in the other, because you are generally dealing with the same people. I've met Masons in the Blue Lodge who've never stepped foot in a concordant or a pendant body that have a deeper Masonic understanding than those who have been a part of all of them for 30, 40 years. Of course, everybody comes into this from a different background. Some people come into it, from a more esoteric base, a foundation, if you will. The preparation as a man before you become the Mason is not always the same. Your foundation is built with maybe a slightly different material. So I wouldn't necessarily be as generous to say, Masonic all-stars, it should be that. It is a form of graduate Freemasonry. There's a reason that you take the first 3 degrees before you take the 4th to the 7th. And it's a totally different topic, so I won't go too far on the tangent, but there's, I deliver this lecture called the 15 points lecture, and it's 15 points in the first 3 degrees where it is blatantly obvious that it is pointing towards something more, and that something more is ultimately the Royal Arch. It's the capitular Masonic experience. But we are given this information from quite literally the first step that we take into a Masonic lodge. From there on, it's pointing you towards something bigger, greater, more complete.
My mother lodge is a colonial lodge in upstate New York that just also happens to have a chapter that also meets in that lodge. So a lot of the same dual members are there. I would say that we were heavily encouraged to pursue the York Rite, specifically the Royal Arch degree, because I heard many of times that it was, supposed to complete the 3 degrees that you take in Blue Lodge. So I went through with it. And what was interesting to me was the degrees themselves. The first 2 in the York Rite, I didn't quite fully understand because I was so used to what was happening in Blue Lodge. And I was like, whoa, this is like a totally different style of Masonry. The story is different. To listeners of the podcast, they've heard me talk about the appendant bodies and the concordant bodies almost in the Star Wars trilogy in comparison. It was the same storyline, but with different characters, but I recognized where things were going. And it wasn't until the Royal Arch degree where I'm like, okay. But then they had different titles like High Priest, and these were new to a Blue Lodge Mason that was going through all of that. The other thing that was different was the color red was very prominent in York Rite. I'm like, oh, well, if I'm going to be a member of this, I'm going to have to get, the red blazer so I can be a part of the group. Oh, and then we also meet once a month. And I had 2 Blue Lodge meetings on the second and fourth Thursday of the month. And now I would have a chapter meeting on the first Thursday of the month. So time demand started to become a factor, but also dues and dinners and all of the other ancillary costs that come with being a member of an organization. And for me, it got to the point where after some evaluation, I'm like, I'm still trying to figure out the story here in Blue Lodge. So I think I'm going to go back to Blue Lodge. And I ended up demitting from being a member of chapter. So that is always a story that I share with brothers who are looking to get into the other bodies in Freemasonry. I also did, basically the same thing with the Scottish Rite, where I was interested, did many of the degrees, but then found myself wanting to go back to Blue Lodge to really learn what was in those first 3 degrees to have a better foundation. Are you finding the same membership challenges in York Rite as we are facing in the Blue Lodge? And is that how embracing the observant movement is a benefit to you?
One of the issues that we find in our chapter in particular, which we've addressed in a very specific way, is that it's spread by word of mouth. As soon as people in the craft lodges heard what we were doing, how we were doing it, even if they've never heard of traditional observance before in their lives, they had just heard from a friend, said, listen, the reason we got involved, it's there. We're finding it here. What we found happening was that members were coming in and they had no foundation, right? Masonry is, to use that analogy, it's building a structure, an internal structure within ourselves. And every structure first needs a foundation. That foundation is the craft lodge, the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry. We even call them foundational degrees in our chapter. If that foundation is not poured correctly, if it's didn't set properly, if it's cracked, any of those things, if the Masonic knowledge isn't there, it's very difficult to build a superstructure, which is what we're doing in the capitular degree cycle. We're building, the arch on top of the foundation. So one of the first things we looked at is implementing a sort of a remedial education process. And I don't mean that to sound derogatory, remedial. It's just that we need to remedy the lack of education that was given in their Blue Lodge experience. This is almost universal. And we have a lot of craft lodges in our area, and they're great lodges, but education is not necessarily the primary focus. And if you don't have the understanding, a certain level of understanding of those first 3 degrees, coming in and taking the Mark Master Mason degree is going to be a bit of a foreign experience, but not necessarily in an interesting, positive way. You're filling in very specific gaps within the earlier degrees. The same with the Most Excellent Master. It's very difficult to complete a building that you didn't quite get the process of building along the way. And the Royal Arch, it's just a completely separate entity there. So the first thing that we did as an observant chapter is to provide incoming members with the information that would equip them to then go through the capitular degree cycle in a way that they would be impacted properly by it. And then, of course, we have an education session. It's about 2 hours long between each degree, so that after the degree's done, maybe a week or two later, we'll bring everybody back in and go through the finer points of what happened in the degree, and not just a walkthrough. You went here, you said this guy said that. What does it mean? What is a deeper relationship to your craft experience, your craft lodge experience? So education is, and this goes back to your original question, education is the central tenet of the traditional observant or the observant Masonic experience. It is to foster inner transformation, not only through the ambiance, if you will, but specifically through shepherding one through the inner journey, being able to elucidate those symbols that we come across. And I always ask, is Masonry obsolete? And if we are taking this antiquated language, which is beautiful in and of itself, but if we're not making it understood and relevant to those who are coming through, then absolutely it's obsolete. It's not performing its function. It's like a bent screwdriver. There's only so much you could tighten with it. So education is absolutely the central tenet, and everything we do in observant Masonic practices to surround that is really to foster the appropriate atmosphere and ambiance to be able to receive that in the most solemn and meaningful way possible.
I'm sitting here listening to you talk, and I'm like, I would want to be a part of something like this if this existed. I'm not saying I was rushed into it. It was definitely something, as Masons would understand, an act of my own free will and accord to go through. But I felt after I went through my York Rite degrees that there was a lot of additional learning that needed to be provided, and I was struggling as to where to find it because, again, I'd only been a Master Mason at that time for a year, so I was still trying to build that foundation of what I had learned in the first 3 Blue Lodge degrees to get to that point. I want to clear up another part of observant Masonry. So when you think about an observant lodge, I got a chance to visit a brothers of ours out in central New York. And then, of course, there is that line. Technically, it's Western New York. When you talk about Rochester, I always forget how close it is. But I did get a chance to visit a lodge that was doing this. And it was very neat from the experience of getting to come in, and the chamber of afflection was a part of the lodge, and going in and collecting your thoughts before you go into the lodge room, which was lit much differently than a Blue Lodge meeting that you might attend with the bright lights, with the candles, and just very solemn, very focused. And it was honestly one of the longest regular lodge meetings that I had been to. I'm not counting degree nights because, those do have to run long for what we're doing. But I didn't mind that I was in there for 2 hours. I enjoyed it, and I really wish that it could have gone for the whole day, at least the car ride length from Albany to Rochester. I would have loved for it to be that long because I enjoyed being with the brothers at that time, and I felt like if I was a sponge, I was sucking up every single drop of esotericism and conversation, and this is what Freemasonry was supposed to be in my mind that I had set out for it. So I'm curious, when you go to a chapter meeting and it's an OM movement, what are your meetings like? How are you setting the tone?
It's not unlike what you experience. Again, it's difficult to compartmentalize the idea of observant Masonry from saying, your craft lodge to your chapter to your, commandery, if there was ever such a thing as an observant commandery in the future. The tenets are largely the same. They've built off of one another. So a lot of it happens before you ever show up to the meeting. There's a very careful vetting of the membership. It's you want to make sure it's almost as the old time affinity lodges, where you might have a lodge of carpenters that, they all kind of worked in the same trades or whatever. In the sense, it's an affinity lodge. You really need a group of brothers, or in our case, companions, who are looking for the same thing and pulling in the same direction, because this is absolutely not for everyone. It's just not going to appeal to the broad spectrum of Masons. it appeals to, as we said in the earlier in the podcast, a lot of the serious Masons who are coming in and what they're looking for. It does appeal to them, but the careful vetting of membership it starts long before you get to the meeting, and that's what's going to ensure a continuity of experience within the organization. So there should be, again, before the meeting ever starts, in our case, a meticulous attention to the detail of the room. The setup in a Royal Arch chapter, it's a slightly more elaborate setup. The opening ritual is 20 to 30 minutes long. It needs to be designed as a sacred place set apart from the profane world. And that's resonant throughout Masonry. When you enter that space, that which you bring with you, it just stays at the door. The outside world, the pressures, the pace, that needs to stay outside in order for it to work its magic, to have its proper effect on you. So it needs to be a place set apart. That's what we were talking about the ambiance of the chapter or the lodge setting. So ways to do that, ways that we do that, there's incense burning somewhere in the room, lightly. It's not, you're not walking into sort of like a vape shop or anything like that, but it's subtle. It all has to be subtle, because if it was too overt, it really wouldn't qualify as being, part of the observant Masonic paradigm. So the incense is burning, the use of a living flame. It's important that there be a living flame, not a pull chain candle system in the room. You hit the nail on the head. It's something that most people miss, and it's really interesting that you caught this. Dimmer, warm lighting. I've been into lodges, traveling. I lived a pretty long time in Virginia, and I was really excited to see some of these really old lodge buildings that I was going into lit with these extremely bright fluorescent lights, and I can hear them buzzing the whole time to the point of distraction. It's incredible what the lighting does to the inner levels of experience and transformation. So as you said, it's dimmer lighting, the appropriate use of sound, and perhaps more importantly, silence. That is something that is missed by most Masonic assemblies, that there should be a specific use of both sound and silence. And so we haven't even entered the lodge or the chapter, setting at this point. This is all happening before you show up. So this is preparatory to, in our chapter, we process into the room. We have a procession with the volume of sacred law. It's under guard, meaning we have a sword bearer who's bringing it in. It's done to the beat of a sort of a drum. There's a procession around the room when all the officers take their positions, and then there's a moment of presence, a moment of silence that sets the tone for what's to come. The meeting hasn't even started yet. And so, at that point, everybody's properly attired. There's a dress code. There's an adherence and an expected adherence to that dress code. If somebody's visiting that chapter, hopefully they've given you some sort of a notice as to what is expected of you as a visitor in terms of dress codes and that. It's not to exclude anybody. If somebody really wants to be a part of that, they don't have, a white tie kit. Right. There's ways of accommodating that. So it shouldn't sound, don't let it come across wrong. But again, these are all things that are preparing the soil, and that's before it ever opens. And of course, precision and proficiency in ritual it just goes without saying. That's the hallmark of an observant Masonic experience. Education being the central focus of the meeting, and not, hey, look, we all have to pay bills. We all have to vote on this petition. That all has to happen in an observant chapter or lodge or a mainstream. But that shouldn't be the sole focus, or the only focus of the meeting, I should say. And another idea is the idea of having an agape, as some sort of a dining experience that is more than just a meal. It's not the big sandwich and a side of coleslaw sort of thing. It's not so much the quality of the food, all that plays a part of it. Quality plays a part in all of the traditional observance or the observance model, but the idea that the meal is something more than just let's jam some food down, then go upstairs and increase our waistlines. It should be a deeper experience, a mini festive board And every time you lay out food, it should be a mini festive board. You don't have to go through all the ritual, but it should be that deep, that there should be some meditation involved with it.
There's some words, if you did the word cloud game, that come with observant masonry. You'll think traditions, you'll think standards, you'll hear brothers talk about attitudes, seriousness, formality. For me, it's a mindset. I think that there's a difference when you visit an observant Mason lodge, that they go from the have to mindset to the want to mindset.
And the focus, I think, on the majority of members is quite a bit different. People come into Masonry for a wide variety of reasons. People get involved in observant Masonry for a narrower band of reasons for that. You also mentioned earlier that, and correctly so, that a chapter is comprised of usually members from more than one craft lodge. Regionally, that's going to vary, and that creates a more diverse set of brothers. It's sort of like traveling within Masonry, but you're going to your chapter and many people are traveling to it. So, and I have to be careful with this because a lot of these Blue Lodge First brothers are going to show up with torches and pitchforks at our door. But that reciprocity that you're asking about within the capitular degree set, you are obligated in one particular degree, the most excellent master degree, to, and I'll paraphrase it here because I'm not sure what the Masonic legality of quoting it, but you're obligated to take that Masonic knowledge that you've gained and bring it back to the Blue Lodge. I'm very heavily paraphrasing it, but you are under obligation to not now just sit here and sort of enjoy the laurels of what you've now experienced, but you are obligated to take that back to, and I will quote this, your less informed brethren.
I think in this episode we've got a lot in here, and for brothers that are like, okay, now I think I have a better understanding of the York Rite, which is great. I really appreciate you sharing the history of that, a better understanding of observant Masonry, just either in Blue Lodge or now that it's getting into the first York Rite chapter here in New York State to embrace this. Awesome. I can't help but think that there's this one companion in my mind who's sitting here banging on his dash of his car right now saying, ask the question. And that question is, what are some takeaways? Can you give like 3 takeaways or ideas that chapters listening now, companions who can say, how can we start presenting this or executing these ideas in our group today?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a question I think that you probably have a lot of, if they've listened this long through my ramblings and tangents, you probably have a lot of Blue Lodge brothers who are kind of asking the same thing, because again, they're not compartmentalized. They're not separate topics. Observance in Masonry is observance in Masonry, whether you're talking about Blue Lodge or Red Lodge, etc. So for whether you're a companion or you're a brother listening to this, it's not something that just suddenly happens. In our case, opportunity met preparation, and it was just the perfect storm of having a sort of critical mass of brothers who were all looking for the same thing, who weren't necessarily getting it in their Blue Lodge experience, who saw the opportunity to provide that in this setting and then executed it. If it was me alone involved in that, it just wouldn't have happened. You don't convince somebody that they should try this. They come into it having already started looking for it. It's not to say that, sideliners or people who've been there for 10, 20 years aren't going to appreciate it and love it. They might never have been exposed to it, so they might not have a point of reference, but it's very difficult to sort of force the subject or force the issue. You may be very, and I don't mean, specifically you, one may be very, motivated, one may have the tact and the skill and the people skills, but again, it's like trying to convince somebody to eat sushi who hates fish or just doesn't have an interest in it. It really has to have a few critical ingredients in play, but it doesn't mean you have to become an observant lodge or an observant chapter. Especially in New York, it's one of the few places, maybe the only places, that it's becoming codified as as a moniker, as a suffix that you can add. But the model itself can be taken to any degree that the brethren feel comfortable with it. So again, it's creating that atmosphere that's set apart. And if you haven't been exposed to that, it's very difficult to describe it. In your case, you've been exposed to it. You went to one of those meetings. You came into this conversation with a very good feel as to what traditional observance or observant practices are. So for me to describe that in a chapter setting, it's not too hard of a jump. I just described to you, okay, well, we turn the lights in this direction, or we use this sort of setup. It's the same tenets that we discussed earlier. Look at the ambiance. Is this a place you feel warm and comfortable coming to? Is it have a sort of a special feeling? Is it different than what you've experienced, not only elsewhere within Masonry, but within the world? It should be a place that you check your baggage at the door. The cell phones are off. There is no, oh, I have a message coming in. You see the brother texting in the corner. No. This is a special place. Again, the practices of ritual excellence is one of those things. It's difficult because it has to happen on a very big level in order to get to that. But is education, and I'm not talking about 101 famous dead Masons. We've heard enough biographies of, TR and George Washington, Masonry 101. It's your first day in the Blue Lodge. What's your education going to be? A biography of George Washington. And then in 1781, so on. That is not what we're talking about. Education is a problem because you have to have somebody who first understands the material and can present it. Not everybody feels comfortable speaking, in front of a crowd. You have to have that knowledge base within. If you're reading from a script, nobody's buying it. Your education has to come from a point of understanding, if not knowing, of wisdom about it, which means a certain mastery of the subject matter. So to have education be a central tenet of a meeting, you need an educator, not a professional educator, but one who is able to deliver that message. So we gave a couple of practical examples elsewhere about, having incense burning, within reason, not the vape shop incense, using the living flame, dimmer, warmer lighting, making sure that the chairs within your lodge or your chapter are appropriately set up. They're not haphazard, that your ceremonials are in good shape, that there's, a precision to the entire thing. So there's no one or two things you can sort of do, but you can ease into that. And there are resources out there. I would refer brothers first to the book, Laudable Pursuit. I don't know if I'm allowed to plug books. I don't get any, Laudable Pursuit. And that is written by, interestingly, the Knights of the North. I'd love to meet some of those authors if they happen to be listening. I'd love to pick their brains a little bit because it's a brilliant work. And if that resonates with you, then you're ready to move on to the next step. You mentioned Observing the Craft, which is Andrew Hammer. There's another book, A Traditional Observance Lodge. And I think that's by a gentleman named Cliff Porter, if I'm not mistaken. And then if you really want to get into it and really get into the esotericism behind creating that atmosphere, there's a wonderful book. It's called Freemasonry as a Way of Enlightenment. And that's by Rémy Boyer. And it's a translation published under Rose Circle Books. It's a translation from French, and it's a difficult read because the translation tends to stay a lot to the original vernacular, the original text, which is a little, but if you get through that, it's a phenomenal book and a treatise on how to establish this and the nitty gritty on investigations and getting the right people in and what this is. So those are just 4 books off the top of my head that I would recommend to anybody looking more into it. And they'll do a much better version than I will be able to do in describing that.
This has been the Craftsman Online Podcast. Again, I want to thank my guest this week for coming on, Brother B.R. Hubbard. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
If Masonic education is important to you, you can visit our website. That's craftsmanonline.com. A reminder, the new episodes of the Craftsman Online Podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.